private buyers said, well, how much is it going to cost us to dispose of the waste and to decommission the reactors? And they got an official figure for the first time from the British government, and it was $30 billion. And as soon as the private purchasers heard that it was $30 billion, they said, forget it, we don't want the nuclear reactors, we'll take everything else. And as a result of that, all the British newspapers are now saying that Britain will probably phase out of nuclear power because they don't know what to do with them. They've already canceled 3 orders for nuclear reactors in Britain. I think it would be smart for Canada to think about phasing out of uranium because, frankly, I think it's causing us more problems than it's worth. And I think it's laying a burden on our future generations that they may find intolerable. And I would not want to have my grandchildren cursing me for leaving them problems that they really can't deal with. Because I think if I were them, I would say, is this fair? I think that one of the most important things, of course, this gets into a much broader question, okay? We organized in the fall in Montreal in September. There was a conference called the World Energy Conference. Have you heard of the World Energy Conference? They meet every 3 years, and they're really big shots. The budget for the World Energy Conference in Montreal, one meeting, which took place for about a week, guess what it was? $22 million. $22 million for one conference lasting 1 week. Canada's contribution to this, by the way, was an energy pavilion, which looked god-awful. I wish I had a picture to show you. You'd laugh yourself sick. But it really did look ridiculous. It cost $2.2 million and was torn down at the end of the week, although some of the material was used for future displays. There was some $800,000 that was just simply discarded as waste from that pavilion. This World Energy Conference was taking place in Montreal in September, and the focus, and this is basically our #1 problem in energy, is that the only people who are deciding energy policy are the people who have something to sell you. In other words, energy policy is being decided by the corporations that are selling you oil or gas or uranium or nuclear power or electricity, and it's not being set by the people who actually need energy to keep society running. In other words, it's a supplier's game, and it's being sold from a supplier's point of view. Now, if you were in the tobacco company, would you tell people how dangerous tobacco smoking was? If you were making your livelihood from selling cigarettes, you would probably try and gloss over it and maybe, you know, encourage people to smoke or at least switch brands or whatever. I think that we're in the situation where we have the pushers in charge of energy policy rather than the users in charge of energy policy, and I think this is a really serious problem. So what we did was we organized with a budget of $40,000 an alternative energy conference taking place 1 week before the World Energy Conference in Montreal called the Green Energy Conference. And what we focused on was energy policy from the user's point of view. And if you look at it from the user's point of view, and by the way, even the people in Ottawa do agree with this intellectually, but politically it's hard to do. Intellectually, they agree that we could do far better by investing our money in energy efficiency than by investing in any of the supply schemes. Nuclear reactors, offshore oil and gas, any of that stuff. There are new light bulbs, for example, which will give you the same luminosity for 1/4 of the electrical demand. You just plug out the old light bulb, which is a 75-watt light bulb, and you screw in the new one, which is an 18-watt light bulb, and you get exactly the same light. I have them in my house, and Hydro-Quebec is now planning to actually give them away as a way of reducing electricity demand to their customers. That's only one example. There's a lot of things that can be done with electrical motors. We know how to increase the efficiency of electric motors by a factor of 2 or 3. And by doing that, but this was known, by the way, this is not new. We knew this 15 years ago. 15 years ago, when they had the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Electric Power Planning in Ontario, Dr. Arthur Porter, do you remember the Porter Inquiry? They had several seminars on this. They had a white-haired professor of engineering from Britain, and he made the point that any competent second-year mechanical engineering student could design a refrigerator that's at least twice as efficient as any refrigerator on the market today. And what's more, if you just waved a magic wand and put such refrigerators into every household in North America like that, you would reduce household electricity demand by 14%. You know? So what I'm saying to you is that it's crazy for us to be listening to the sellers of fuels when fuels is not the problem. In fact, the problem with fuels is that they are the things which are polluting the environment. The more fuel we use, the more acid rain we create, the more carbon dioxide we create, the more high-level radioactive waste we create. That's a fool's game. We should be learning how to use energy more efficiently. Now, believe it or not, this has been very well researched and very well documented over the last 15 years, and we know how to do it. We know the technologies. We know how much it costs. We know how many jobs it creates, and on almost every score, it's a better way to go. It costs less money, it creates more jobs, it's better for the environment, it's better for the economy, etc., etc., etc. Why aren't we doing it? The reason we're not doing it is because nobody thinks it's their job to do it. The corporations say, hey, that's not our job. We're in the job of selling electricity, or we're in the job of selling oil, or we're in the job of selling coal or gas. And the politicians say, that's not our job. We're in the job of trying to just basically keep things going. It's not our job to go into communities and start changing lifestyles. You know, that would be fascist or dictatorship or something. So basically, nobody wants to touch it. And yet that's what we should be doing.
Yeah, but a lot of other people want to grab a handful of the money involved. I attended an ad hoc meeting of the bigwigs of this town, meeting with Ontario Hydro at the EDO office, and these bigwigs stood up and said, put on another CO2 unit at our coal-fired station. Bring some money to this town. They kept on saying that, you know, the nuclear industry, well, people are just emotional and overreacting to that. Don't worry, it's just an emotional problem. That's what's happening. The business people that want to make money out of it are pushing it on us as well, on a local basis as well as the industry.
Okay, but let me point out something, though. I don't think that, that one should be careful not to just point fingers at one particular type of person. I mean, it's true that there are businesses and people make money from businesses. There's nothing wrong with that. What we have to do is start learning how to have businesses which are more environmentally sound and which lead to what is called sustainable development. You know that the World Commission, there was a World Commission sponsored by the United Nations on economy and environment. And they published a report which everyone should try and read or read an excerpt from or something. It's called Our Common Future. And it's called the Brundtland Commission Report because Prime Minister Brundtland, who is a marvelous woman, Prime Minister of Denmark, was the principal author and the principal commissioner. There were other prime ministers from other countries involved and other top officials. And what they said is that we are facing a critical stage in the development of our society on Earth. And that is, we're running up against the environment. We're doing tremendous damage to the planet. And we have to change our whole way of doing things so that we have the concept of sustainability foremost in our minds. So that our planning, we shouldn't say, oh, it's a choice between either the environment or development. We have to think of sustainable development. Now, sustainable development, unfortunately, it may be a poor choice of words because people who are, let's say, not so environmentally conscious might think that what it means is sustaining development, as it is, business as usual. But that's not what it really means. What it means is developing sustainability. That's what it means. And that's what we have to do. And the point is, in the energy field, we probably know better than in any other field how to do it. There was a 12-volume report published by Energy Mines and Resources in Ottawa back about 10 years ago called 2025, Towards a Soft Energy Future for Canada. And this 12-volume report, there was one volume for each of the 10 provinces, there was one volume for the territories, and there was one volume which was an overview volume. There was also a paperback popularization of this published by Hertig Publishers in Edmonton called Life After Oil. And basically what it said is that we could in Canada, without any economic sacrifice or penalty, we could by the year 2025 be supporting a population about twice the size of what it is now, with a GNP about 4 times as big as what it is now, and without even changing any of our lifestyles, even though it might be desirable to do so, and we could at the same time be using less energy than we were using in 1978. How? Simply by using available technology for increased efficiency and energy use. Moreover, they pointed out that 80 to 90% of that energy in the year 2025 could be met from renewable energy sources, which means that by that time you could have phased out nuclear power and a lot of the coal-burning plants too. Now, the problem is that we are not putting our human intelligence, we're not putting our engineers, our money, our brain power, our resources into really studying that type of approach as perhaps the best approach, or the approach that we should be following as a society. And the real challenge that we have as a society is how do we get people's talents, and I mean business talents, engineering talents, all kinds of talents, how do we get them channeled in a more constructive direction? That's really what it comes down to. And what Amory Lovins is doing, Amory Lovins was one of our keynote speakers at the Green Energy Conference, and by the way, I promised that I would send a copy of the Green Energy talk given by Amory Lovins, which is very inspiring and very down-to-earth and practical at the same time. Amory is a good personal friend of mine, and he's also the director of the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is a think tank on sustainable energy policy. And what was I going to say? I forget what I was going to say now. I lost my thread. At any rate, what he is basically, oh yeah, I know what I was going to say. What I was going to say is that he has worked out a lot of ways in which businessmen and even corporations can play a profitable role in making the transition towards a sustainable energy society. And as a matter of fact, Pacific Gas and Electric in California just gave the Rocky Mountain Institute $10 million to work on some of these proposals. And what he's basically doing is he's telling the utilities like Ontario Hydro and Hydro-Quebec and so on, he's telling them, look, it costs you a pile of money to build these nuclear reactors, right? Right. Well, instead of spending the money building nuclear reactors, why don't you spend the money on your own customers? Basically, send a notice out to your customers saying, we, Ontario Hydro, or we, Hydro-Quebec, will pay for any energy efficiency improvements that you as a customer want to make. And what happens is the customers, which include factories, businessmen, commercial institutions, households, and so on, can use Ontario Hydro as a bank to borrow money to do efficiency improvements and pay for them with not their money, but Hydro's money. What happens then is your fuel bill goes down, your energy bill goes down, and you pay back to Hydro the difference in your energy bill before and after until it's paid off. It turns out the payback time turns out to be 2 or 3 years in most cases. And what's the advantage to Hydro? The advantage to Hydro is they get a much faster return on their investment than they would by building a nuclear power plant. And by investing in energy efficiency, they get a lot more friendly people on their side, and they also are better for the environment, and they also create more jobs in the economy. And in fact, as a corporation, it's a good strategy. So what he's trying to do is to try and get the money motive channeled into sustainable development. And I think that that's really the way we've got to start thinking of going.
Absolutely, but at that meeting there was not one question on energy conservancy. They were pushing for more energy.
Right. And then we should take a break, as you said.
Dr. Edwards, even if the nuclear industry was shut down tomorrow,
Right.
and we stop producing all the stuff that you're worried about, we would still have the problem in place.
Right.
And presumably, the leak where it is, presumably that's not responsible because presumably it's not safe where it is.
Right.
What would you do with the historic waste?
I think with the historic waste, I would officially declare it to be a national problem of the first order, and I would try and get the best minds working on this problem, and I would regard the efforts made to solve the problem as a sincere experiment in trying to develop methods for disposing of this waste, not proceeding on the assumption that it's just a question of putting it somewhere and forgetting about it, because we know that it's going to be okay. I think that that's an arrogant attitude. I think it's a fallacious attitude. I think it's riding for a fall. I think that what we should do is officially announce that this is a serious problem. For example, in the States, the Wall Street Journal front page story in February of 1987, I believe, they said that the uranium tailings in the United States, 222 million tons of it in the United States, is an economic as well as an ecological time bomb. because it's going to hit either ecologically or economically. It's going to cost billions to deal with this problem. We have to get serious about it. Now, I don't believe my government, when they tell me they're serious about solving this problem, when they are allowing new mines to open up and produce more of this waste at the same time that they're trying to figure out what to do with this historical waste. I think the proper place to begin is to try and deal with the problem at the source first, because that's where you're adding to the problem. If you deal with the problem at the source first, and if you deal successfully with the problem at the source, then I think it may give you very valuable clues as to how to deal with the historic waste. You may find that whatever solution you come up with at the front end, at the source, to deal with the problem, is going to help you to deal with the historic waste as well, because you're going to learn some valuable lessons. Now, this is in fact, I'm not a big fan of everything the U.S. does. I think the U.S. makes a lot of really dumb mistakes, but I think they have done a few smart things too. And one thing they've done in the States that we have never done in Canada is they passed an act of Congress called the National Uranium Stabilizations Program, which basically does not try and dispose of uranium tailings, the historic waste in the States, but which puts a lot of money into stabilizing the tailings. In other words, doing the kinds of things that should be done to guarantee that at least in the short term, the problem is not going to get any worse. That these historic wastes are going to be properly covered, properly fenced, properly maintained, properly inspected, but not disposed of because we don't know how to do it yet. Mr. Chairman?
About 15 minutes left. Do you want to take a quick break? Or would you just rather ask some questions? Are there any other questions?
By the way, I don't mean to imply that the energy problem is an easy one. No matter which way you go, whether you go for more supply or whether you go for reducing demand, there are problems. The thing is that the problems associated with the reduction of demand are perhaps more manageable. And certainly from an environmental point of view, they're more manageable. From a human point of view, it's going to take a lot of effort to try and get the overlapping jurisdictions working together. But again, it's not by any means a hopeless problem. I mean, when you look at Eastern Europe and some of the changes that have taken place there, you say, hey, maybe more things are possible than we thought. Maybe even here in Ontario or elsewhere, we can get changes happening whereby people say, yep, we've got to start moving in that direction.
As we talked earlier, we go back to what, 78 dealing with the oil problem, fragments of the metal issue. Much of what you were saying tonight kind of reminded me of NPU and others were saying back in 78, 77. Sounds discouraging. I wonder if you need it that way, or whether in fact you see whether we're making any progress at all in the last 12 years.
Okay, you're quite right. In fact, much the same kind of thing was being said 12 years ago, because it's not, most of it is not new information. However, if you get a chance to look at Amory Lovin's keynote address at the Green Energy Conference, you will see that in fact there has been a lot of technology development in the last 12 years that wasn't available 12 years ago, which allows us to reduce energy real fast, reduce energy demand real fast because of new technological breakthroughs in drive power, in lighting, and in other areas of the economy, where we know now how to make fast changes in the demand. So that's good news. The bad news is, and another piece of good news, is that consciousness is a lot higher now. I think that worldwide, there is a much more willingness to accept the fact that we are in trouble, that we can't just slough it off, we can't just shake it off. We are in trouble, and we are doing too much damage to the environment, and we're going to have to change our ways somehow. So I think the consciousness has grown a great deal in the last 12 years. The problem is that consciousness is not enough. I mean, you can be conscious of a problem, and all it does is make you sleep less well at night. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem. What is necessary, I think, is to go beyond collective consciousness to collective will. We have to have a collective will to do something about it. And that means we have to transmit a message to our politicians at all levels that this is really serious and that we want something done about it. We don't just want flowery words, and we don't just want talk. We want action. And what's more, and perhaps this is the lesson that's been the hardest one to learn, is that it's a mistake to expect the leadership to come from the top down. It's got to go, I think, the other way around. I think the leadership has got to come, in many cases, from the bottom up, rather than from the top down. In other words, it's not enough just to say to the politicians, do something. You've got to say to the politicians, do this. And if you say, do this, and if it happens to be a good thing, good for the economy, good for jobs, good for the environment, you've got a much better chance that the politician might act upon it. But if you just say to the politician, do something, the politician's going to say, do what? And slough it off. And basically what we're facing is a situation, I personally believe that on all the global issues facing the planet, things like disarmament, things like war, things like human rights, things like women's rights, things like nuclear power and so on, and things like the environment, on all these global issues, I think the leadership has come from the grassroots, not from the top. And I think that when Margaret Thatcher and Brian Mulroney start saying how important the environment is, the real significance of that is not that they're providing leadership, but that they're getting the message.
A number of communities have indicated that they are interested or are thinking about having a nuclear waste repository. Now, what if all communities should decide to opt out? Could the government, in their great wisdom, decide, well, you're going to get it whether you opt out or not?
That's a good question, and this is a question which also arises with the high-level radioactive waste too, which is coming down the line. I think this is a hard question, and it's a question which each community is going to have to deal with. Did you hear the question?
This is exactly what I want. Would you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah. The question. Yeah. The question was, what would happen if all the communities opted out of this process, so that you didn't have any communities interested anymore? Would the government then just arbitrarily pick a community and say, well, it's going to go here then? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do believe that until I am convinced that the government is really taking this problem seriously by dealing with it at all levels, including at the source, then I think that opting out on the part of all the communities might not be such a bad thing. Because what it would do is deliver a message to the politicians that, no, we're not happy with this approach. It's too much of a piecemeal approach. We want to see this thing approached in a much more serious, comprehensive way. You could also say, we don't want it in our backyards, but I think that, I don't think that Canadians are irresponsible. I don't think Canadians are saying, no, we just don't want to face the problem. I think that there's a suspicion, and I think that suspicion is partly justified, that the government is only speaking half-truths when it says that they're taking the problem seriously. I wonder what happens when they get the waste up to some other community. Suppose it did happen to come to some northern community, for example. I would guess that once it was up there and once they had spent a bit of money building the facility and so on, I imagine they'd lose interest remarkably fast in what happens to it later. And if problems did develop later on, if there was evidence of damage being done, if there was evidence of radioactive leakage from this buried waste, how much money would they be willing to spend, how quickly, to deal with the problem at that point? This is a real question. And I think it's a legitimate question, and I think we have to ask this question of our society in general. Are we really serious about dealing with the environmental questions? I think that opting out at this point probably does two things. It delivers a message on behalf of the community saying that we ourselves are not interested, but it may also deliver a message saying that we're not confident that this problem is being addressed in the correct way. That does not let us off the hook. It means that we have to take an active interest as citizens in trying to see what would be a more correct way of doing it. Now, with regard to high-level waste, the question is often raised very similar to this gentleman over here in the checkered shirt who said we have historical wastes, which we have to deal with even if all the nuclear plants are shut down tomorrow. We do have high-level radioactive waste. We can't go back and change history. We've got it. What are we going to do with it? It's true that we have it, and it's true that we're going to have to do something with it. But I would ask you to consider this, that it may be a completely different story if you decide to phase out of nuclear power, let's say, theoretically. Then the amount of waste is finite. And you could imagine possibly coming up with a method which might be satisfactory for disposing of it all once and for all. That's conceivable. We don't know how to do it now, but we might find out how to do it. All right? However, if you are going to continue expanding the nuclear industry, then you will always be producing more nuclear waste. And it turns out that if you just do some mathematical calculations, which I've done in another report, which I didn't bring, but which I can send you if you like, it's called Nuclear Waste, What Me Worry. If you do a little calculation, if electricity demand, if nuclear power grows by, say, 5% per year, which is pretty modest, okay? Let's suppose nuclear power grows by 5% per year. It turns out that you have to wait at least 10 years before you can bury the waste, because otherwise it's too hot. You have to let it cool off for at least 10 years, if not 20 years, before you can bury it. Well, because of that time lag, it turns out that the nuclear power production of waste is going up like this, and the burial of waste has a time delay, and so the gap is the amount of waste that's left at the surface unburied. That gap will continue to grow at 5% per year. In other words, the amount of unburied nuclear waste at the surface of the Earth will continue to grow at 5% per year, even if you bury it as fast as you can. That's something people don't often think about, but it's a fact. My claim is that when you talk about burying nuclear waste, you should be talking about getting it all together and burying it once and for all. You should not be just talking about clearing the deck so you can make more.
I just spent about 16, 17 hours on the phone with Ontario Hydro, various officials, various departments, talking about why we're pushing this nuclear building on us. They want 1 to 3, maybe possibly 4 new reactors, and they're saying it's cheap power. Now we know why it's cheap, because they never paid the waste bill.
Mm-hmm.
They say it's going to stop us from getting the greenhouse effect, and that if we don't have it, the lights will go up.
Hmm.
Now, why are these people with all that smarts they're talking about still playing this old game?
That's a good question. I don't know. I do think that these people are sincere. I mean, some of them. I don't think they're all sincere, but I think some of them are sincere. And the only thing I could compare it to really is, I'll tell you something. When I was in school, I was in science. I graduated from math, physics, and chemistry at the University of Toronto. And in fact, one of the occupations I was considering was nuclear science. I thought nuclear science was quite fascinating. I still think it's quite fascinating. It's easy to understand how people get fascinated by it. I mean, it is very interesting. If you're a scientist, by God, there's lots of questions there. But I do believe that there's something like almost a scientific, almost like a religious belief that nuclear power must be good for something. I really think that it's almost like a religious belief that these scientists believe that there has to be something good about nuclear power, that it can't be just bad. And therefore, our job is to find out what's good about it, to find out what it can be used for good purposes. And generating electricity is one of the things that they've thought about for making good use of this. You know, it's sort of like a gift of God. You know, uranium is a gift of God. Surely we can't turn our backs on this gift. I really think that there's a lot of this in it. I also think that many scientists believe, with a conviction that's almost religious, that in fact civilization is going to fall apart if we don't have nuclear power. That nuclear power is absolutely necessary. That we are really literally going to freeze in the dark if we don't have nuclear power. Now, if you do believe that, then of course it justifies everything. If I believed that nuclear power was absolutely essential for human existence, then of course it doesn't matter what